In the outskirts of Pulaski, Tennessee, 1868, where the soil still bled from the Civil War and men wore white hoods to hide their shame, there lived a girl no one noticed. She had no voice in town, no name anyone bothered to learn, and no reason, so they believed, to fight back. She was the laundry girl, small, thin, barefoot even in winter. Her hands were always cracked from lye soap and boiling water, and her back bore the marks of men who convinced themselves they were righteous. The Ku Klux Klan had risen like mold in the dark, and when their robes dirtied from night rides, bloodshed, and terror, they brought them to her, the girl they believed too powerless to understand, too frightened to resist, too insignificant to matter. They were wrong, because she had watched them, and memorized their voices, and learned their gestures, their boots, their rings, their patterns of cruelty. And when the night came that she found the shattered body of the boy she loved lying in the riverbank, mud-lynched, branded, mutilated, something inside her cracked open. Not grief, not fear, something far older, far colder. Patience. She would not stab them in the open. She would not scream. She would not run. She would wait. She would plan. And when the time came, she would poison every last one of them from the inside of the robes they believed made them untouchable. This is the story of the girl they never feared, and the 17 Klansmen who died screaming because of her. The morning she found Isaiah, the fog was so thick it felt like the earth was holding its breath. The laundry girl, whose name, whispered only by the few who loved her, was Marjorie, was walking barefoot along the riverbank, carrying a woven basket full of uniforms and robes stolen straight from the terror of the night before. She always washed early. Dawn was the only hour the town left her alone. But that morning, the river was not alone. At first, she thought it was driftwood stuck between reeds. A shape. Still. Heavy. Then she saw the bare foot, brown skin swollen, toes curled inward like they were trying to hold on to life. The basket dropped from her arms. "Isaiah," she whispered, though she already knew. She ran, knees crashing into mud, hands scraping reeds aside, and fell beside what remained of him. Isaiah had been 17. Gentle, soft-spoken, the only boy who ever dared to slip her a wildflower tucked behind his back. Now the flower keeper had been crushed like a weed. His chest was carved with a symbol she had scrubbed off 100 white robes, a crooked burning cross. His face, what was left of it, tilted toward her as if he'd waited for her to say goodbye. Marjorie didn't cry. The tears came later, but not now. Now was for memorizing. The mud was fresh, meaning the killers had not been gone long. Their boot prints trailed back toward the woods, a thick line of heavy-soled tracks. Klan boots. She had scrubbed enough of them to know the pattern by sight. A familiar ring-shaped indentation pressed into the mud where someone had knelt. She knew that ring. She had polished it herself with trembling fingers. It belonged to Mr. Horace Greeley, the man who led the Midnight Riders, the man who once told her she was lucky to breathe white man's air. "I'm sane." She felt her throat close. Not with fear. Fear was something she had learned to swallow years ago, but with something far more dangerous. Purpose. Isaiah had trusted her with his last smile. She would return the favor with his vengeance. She covered Isaiah's body with her shawl, whispered a promise against his cold cheek, and stood, slowly, as if rising from a grave herself. The basket lay overturned, white robes scattered like fallen ghosts. Marjorie gathered them one by one, her fingers steady. Last night's mud stained their hems. A smear of blood streaked one sleeve. A torn seam revealed the coward's stitching inside. She counted them. 1 robe, 2, 3, 17 total. 17 men rode out last night. 17 men killed Isaiah. 17 men would die. She lifted a robe and held it up to the sun. It was heavy, thick with sweat, dirt, and the scent of gunpowder that soap couldn't wash away. Perfect. She knew plants. She knew roots. She knew the powders hidden behind the smokehouse from the old woman who had healed slaves long before healing was a crime. And she knew exactly how long it took for poison to seep into skin through sweat. She folded each robe neatly, stacking them like folded shrouds. Then she walked back toward town, past the trees, past the cabins, past the places where Isaiah once held her hand. Her face remained calm, her steps slow, her breathing steady. because she understood something only the broken ever learn. Revenge was a patient creature, and she was done being prey. When she reached the laundry shed, she bolted the door, lit a fire, and laid out the robes like a surgeon preparing bodies. She whispered Isaiah's name only once more. Then she began mixing the powders. Tonight, the clan would collect their robes, and tomorrow morning, their wives would find their bodies rotting inside them. 17 men, 17 robes, 17 graves waiting to be filled. And Marjorie, the girl no one ever noticed, was ready to make sure not one of them escaped. The first body was found behind the smokehouse, face down in the mud, his white robes soaked through like a drowned shroud. They didn't recognize him at first. The hood had melted into his skin, fibers fused to flesh so tightly that when Sheriff Culver tried to peel it away, half the cheek came with it. He gagged. The others pretended not to. "Burn the body," one of the men muttered. "No," the sheriff snapped. "This ain't sickness. This is something else. Something done to him. Done to him." Delilah was folding towels in the manor laundry when the news reached her. A whisper, a tremor, a flicker of panic passing from mouth to mouth. She didn't look up, didn't blink, just kept folding. Smooth, steady, quiet. Miss Camille rushed in moments later, skirts swishing like storm clouds. "Delilah, did you hear?" Camille's voice trembled with both fear and fascination. "One of them is dead." Delilah dipped her head meekly. "Yes'm. Heard it." She never asked which one. She knew. Camille clutched her rosary, not out of faith but nerves. "Mama says it must be fever, or a curse." Her eyes narrowed, as if hunting for a reaction. "Do you believe in curses, Delilah?" Delilah placed another towel atop the stack. Perfect fold, edges aligned like a blade. "I believe folks get back what they give," she said softly. Camille shivered, as if a cold draft had slid down her spine. The men buried the dead clansman in the back field, far from the others. No ceremony, no psalms, just shovels and fear. When the dirt thudded over him, it didn't sound like soil hitting wood. It sounded like a warning. Before sunrise the next morning, 2 more dropped. One collapsed in the cotton field, hands clawing at his hood as if it were tightening, strangling him. The second died on his porch, mouth foaming dark as tar, robe eaten through in long, ragged strips. Whatever they had worn so proudly, whatever they hid behind was now devouring them. And Delilah? She stirred her boiling pot of lye in the laundry shed, steam rising like a ghost's breath. The second batch of robes hung drying behind her. Crisp. Perfect. White as winter. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her hands moved with the same calm rhythm as always, as if she had been born washing away filth, as if she had always known this day would come. From the doorway, old Queenie, the cook, leaned in. "Girl," Queenie whispered, eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "You hearing what's happening?" Delilah didn't turn. "Everybody hearing. They think somebody cursed the cloth." "I reckon they right." Queenie stiffened. "Delilah, what you do?" Delilah finally looked up. Her eyes, usually gentle, brown, soft, were something else now, harder, sharper, but not cruel. "No, not cruel. Just certain. I washed they robes," she said. "Same as always. But with what?" Delilah lowered the ladle into the pot. The liquid bubbled thick, rising, popping like tiny explosions. Inside it, the roots she'd gathered in the woods, roots that killed slow, roots that killed deep, were dissolving into the white linen fibers. "Truth," Delilah said. "I washed him with truth." Queenie's breath hitched. "Child, this is death you dealin' in." Delilah's jaw tensed. They dealt in death first. She turned back to her work, knuckles tightening around the ladle. "They took my brother, Queenie, took him in a white hood, left him hanging from a pine tree, said it was justice." The pot hissed. The room swelled with heat. "They think linen can hide sin," Delilah whispered. "But cloth remembers, and now it's given everything back." That night, a storm rolled over the county wind, whipping branches, lightning shredding the sky. But the real storm gathered inside the plantation house, where 5 surviving clansmen pounded on the door, demanding answers. "Something's wrong with the robes," one shouted. "They burn like acid." "They ain't natural," another screamed. They, he collapsed on the parlor floor mid-sentence, convulsing. His hood smoked, his skin blistered beneath it. The others screamed and backed away. Mrs. Whitlock shrieked, "Take him outside! Outside!" But no one dared touch him, except Delilah. She stepped quietly from the hall, her shadow long in the lantern light. "If a man hides behind a hood," she said, "best be sure the hood ain't hiding from him." Her words slithered through the silence like a blade. The dying man froze, eyes wide, glassy, staring right at her as if realizing truth too late. Delilah kneeled beside him, her face calm as moonlit water. "You know me," she whispered. A shudder passed through him. Recognition, horror. You're. The rest drowned in his own choking breath. The final spasm came, and then stillness. Delilah stood, smoothing her apron. Behind her, the thunder growled like wolves circling a carcass. Behind her, the men trembled. And behind her, unseen but ready, the next set of robes hung drying in the shed. Stiff, white, hungry. The night after the last robe had been laundered, the air in the quarters was thick with tension. Mavis moved quietly between the stacks of folded laundry, her hands steady despite the knowledge of what she had set in motion. She could feel the eyes of the other slaves on her, half in admiration, half in fear. No one dared speak of the poison, but everyone knew what it meant. The robes, once innocent symbols of terror, had become instruments of reckoning. Out in the fields, the men of the clan believed their careful rituals and codes would protect them. They laughed and drank in the darkness, confident that the masks they wore, the symbols they carried, and the fear they instilled made them untouchable. They had no idea that Mavis had been inside the very fabric of their power, sowing vengeance into every seam, every fold, every lining. The first to don a poisoned robe was a man named Harlan, a man whose cruelty had been whispered about in every corner of the county. He wore the hood with pride, strutting in the moonlight as though the night itself belonged to him. Within an hour, his laughter choked into coughs, his face pale and sweating. He collapsed behind the barn, his hands clawing at his chest, thrashing until he fell still, the life draining from him as slowly as the poison took hold. The other men dismissed it at first, thinking he had merely overindulged in spirits, unaware that death had come in a more subtle, merciless form. By the second night, the panic began. One by one, the men who had received the tainted robes discovered that something was horribly wrong. Some were too proud to admit it at first, blaming fatigue or the chill of the night, until their skin burned, their mouths filled with an acrid taste that no amount of water could wash away. Swelling and vomiting, their bodies convulsed as the poison clawed inward. The screams, muffled by fear and the cotton of their hoods, became an unholy symphony that reverberated through the dark woods. Mavis watched from a hidden corner, her heart a strange mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction. She did not celebrate their suffering. She had seen enough bloodshed to understand the weight of vengeance. Yet the faces of the clan men, twisted in disbelief and agony, offered a grim justice for years of terror inflicted on her people. Every cry that split the night reminded her of the faces of her sisters and brothers, of families ripped apart, of children stolen, and of the terror that had been forced upon them. The local sheriff, a man of half-hearted convictions, was the first to investigate the unusual deaths. He arrived at the plantation, shining his lantern into the darkness, and found the lifeless bodies of Harlan and two others, their robes still clinging to their convulsing forms. "Curses," he muttered, shaking his head. He found no signs of struggle, no external wound, just men stricken by a fate that seemed supernatural. Whispers spread quickly through the town, stories of a vengeful spirit or witch hiding among the enslaved. They did not suspect Mavis. The idea that a quiet, diligent girl from the laundry could orchestrate such destruction was inconceivable. By the fourth night, the poison had claimed 7 more, the robes like silent witnesses to a justice long overdue. The clan, once brash and untouchable, began to falter, questioning every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every quiet glance. Their numbers thinned not by battle, but by meticulous, almost surgical revenge. Each death was calculated, each moment drawn out by Mavis's careful hand. Her knowledge of herbs, roots, and toxins taught to her in secret by her grandmother had become her armor, her method of reclaiming power in a world that had denied her any. Yet Mavis understood the fragility of her plan. One misstep, one careless glance, and her life would end as swiftly as theirs had. She moved with precision, timing each robe, each pour of poisoned water, each hidden powder in the folds with unwavering discipline. The plantation had become a theater, and she was both conductor and performer, orchestrating a symphony of quiet, righteous retribution. By dawn of the fifth night, the first signs of despair were evident among the surviving Klan men. Paranoia took hold. Every friend became a potential enemy, every shadow a harbinger of death. Mavis knew that by the seventh night, when the final robes would be worn, the balance of terror would shift irreversibly. No amount of secrecy could protect them from the consequences of their cruelty. No charm, no oath, no symbol of power could withstand the meticulous vengeance of one who had been forced to endure too much. And through it all, Mavis moved like a ghost in the quarters, folding laundry, whispering songs to herself that kept her steady, that reminded her of what she was fighting for. Each robe was a thread in a web of justice that she had woven over months of quiet observation and careful planning. She knew that by the time the sun rose on the eighth morning, the town would never forget the lesson delivered by a single girl who had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, and who had, in silence, become a force of reckoning no one could ignore. The night ended not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping dread. As men began to vanish one by one, the poisoned hoods claiming their lives while leaving the plantation itself eerily silent. And in that silence, Mavis understood something profound. Power, like justice, could be wielded by the smallest hands when the mind behind them was sharp enough and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. By the fourth night, the tension on the plantation was palpable, a heavy cloak that pressed against every corner of the house and quarters. Mavis moved among the laundry, folding the next set of hoods with precision. Each stitch was deliberate, each fold considered. The poisons she had mixed in secret powders from roots, extracts from bitter herbs, a few potent chemicals she had managed to acquire through barter were deadly, but subtle enough that even the most cautious men would not suspect anything until it was far too late. Her fellow slaves watched silently. They didn't dare speak of what was happening, but their eyes conveyed understanding, a shared sense of grim satisfaction. For years, these men in white hoods had terrorized the county, whipping, burning, and threatening anyone who resisted. Now, the silent and unassuming girl from the laundry was the instrument of retribution. The first victim of the night was Barnwell, a particularly vicious overseer who had made his reputation through cruelty. He had strutted in earlier that evening, boasting of the fear he inspired, and mocking the laborers as he adjusted the hood on his head. But the poison, expertly sewn into the lining by Mavis's careful hands, worked faster than any whip he had ever wielded. Within minutes, his speech became slurred, his movements erratic. His laughter faltered into coughing and wheezing, his eyes rolling as a thick, burning sensation coursed through his body. He fell to the ground, convulsing, the hood still clinging to his sweating face. Next came Tomlin, a man whose cruel reputation preceded him, known for dragging children through the mud as punishment for minor missteps. He wore the tainted hood proudly, unaware of the silent danger woven into its fibers. By the time he reached the meeting hall, his skin had begun to redden, a slow, insidious rash spreading across his face and neck. He clawed at it frantically, tears streaming down his cheeks as the poison's effect spread internally. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the dim lantern light glinting off the hoods stacked neatly on the table, a silent mockery of his arrogance. Outside, the plantation lay shrouded in darkness. The remaining Klan men were growing suspicious, whispering to one another about the sudden deaths and illnesses that had stricken their comrades. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado weakening with each scream that echoed from the quarters. They began questioning their own rituals, their hoods, their symbols, wondering if some unseen force had infiltrated their ranks. Mavis moved carefully, her hands never shaking, despite the growing fear she felt for herself. One wrong move, one hint of discovery, and all her careful planning could unravel in an instant. Yet, she continued, folding and refolding hoods, sprinkling powders into linings, tracing invisible patterns that would ensure the maximum effect. This was not a crime of passion. It was a carefully measured act of justice, one designed to hit where it hurt the most, while leaving the orchestrator invisible and untouchable. By midnight, 5 more men had fallen, writhing on the ground as their internal organs rebelled against the slow-acting poisons. The sounds of agony were muffled by the thick cotton of the hoods, but no amount of muffling could hide the horror from the rest of the plantation. Even the farm dogs whined and hid in the corners, sensing the unnatural disturbance in the air. Through it all, Mavis hummed a quiet tune taught to her by her grandmother, a lullaby turned chant of vengeance. Each note was a memory of injustice, of mothers and children harmed by men in white hoods. Each fold of the cloth, each sprinkle of poison, was a note in her symphony of revenge. She knew that by the 7th and final night, the lesson would be complete, that those who had terrorized her community for so long would finally understand that power, taken through fear and cruelty, could be undone by intelligence, patience, and courage. The remaining Klan men were growing desperate. They no longer trusted each other, whispering about curses and unseen spirits. Superstition, once a tool they used against others, now held them in a vice of terror. And while they panicked, Mavis worked in the shadows, unseen and unstoppable, turning their own tools of terror against them. By the end of Chapter 4, the night had drawn deep. 10 men had been taken silently, their hoods and robes still clinging to them as evidence of the slow, inevitable justice. Mavis folded the remaining 7 robes, her mind already calculating the order, timing, and placement of the remaining victims. The plantation had become a theater, and she, a quiet, unnoticed girl from the laundry, had become the invisible hand that orchestrated a reckoning no one would forget. She paused, wiping her hands on her apron, listening to the distant sounds of men calling for each other, panicked whispers carried by the wind. Tonight, the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Fear had begun to infiltrate the hearts of those who once instilled it, and Mavis, a single, determined girl, had become the author of that fear. And as she looked at the folded hoods stacked neatly in the corner, she knew when the final night came, the remaining 7 men would learn the true cost of cruelty. The 5th night had arrived with a heavy, humid stillness that blanketed the plantation. The moon hung low, barely lighting the crooked fences and twisted trees that framed the main house. The quiet was deceptive, for inside the laundry room, Mavis moved with a calm born of precision and grim purpose. The last 7 robes, the remaining instruments of her vengeance, lay folded neatly on the wooden table, each one marked and prepared for its next wearer. She inhaled deeply, letting the faint scent of lye and cotton mix with the metallic tang of the powders she had worked into the linings. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear of being caught, but from the weight of what was to come. Each man she would target tonight represented decades of terror, years of whippings, burning crosses, stolen lives, and the unspeakable cruelty that she had witnessed with silent eyes. The time for subtlety was ending. The time for decisive justice was upon her. Outside, the plantation seemed almost alive. The rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, and shadows shifted like unseen watchers. The Klan men were unaware that tonight, their very symbols of terror, the hoods and robes they wore with pride, had become weapons against them. The first of tonight's victims would enter the main hall soon, expecting to intimidate, to flaunt his power, unaware that it was Mavis who now held all control. The first hood was taken and fitted into a satchel. She carefully arranged the poison so that the seams would hide it entirely, ensuring that any man who donned the garment would inhale, touch, and feel the full effect of her meticulous design. This was no accident, no rash vengeance. It was justice administered with a scalpel-like precision. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the plantation's tension became almost unbearable. Mavis could hear faint laughter and the shuffle of boots across the wooden floors, each sound reminding her of the living nightmares who had once used fear to dominate others. Now, the balance of power had shifted, and though her body was small and her presence seemingly inconspicuous, her actions that night would reverberate with terror far greater than any whip, any fire, or any cross ever could. The first man entered, Tomlin, a particularly vicious overseer known for dragging children through the mud as punishment. He pulled the hood from the satchel, laughing to himself, confident and cruel. Mavis's lips curved into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile as she watched him adjust the hood. The poison began its silent work almost immediately, first a faint dizziness, then a burning nausea that spread through his limbs. His hands clawed at his own face, smearing the white fabric, eyes wide with panic, realizing too late that the garment had betrayed him. One by one, the remaining men arrived, each stepping into a carefully orchestrated trap. Mavis moved silently behind the shadows, her own breath controlled, her presence ghost-like. By the third victim, panic had begun to spread through the remaining clan members, whispers of curses and hexes growing louder with every muffled scream from the hall. Superstition, which they had once wielded to terrify others, now turned inward to consume them with dread. She recalled the stories whispered among the enslaved workers, tales of women and men who had sought vengeance when the world offered none. Mavis had taken those lessons to heart. Her grandmother's chants, the old lullabies, and the quiet counsel of other women who had endured injustice all converged into this night's symphony of silent retribution. Every movement of her hands, every placement of a poisoned lining, every fold of cotton was a note in that composition. By the stroke of 1 in the morning, 5 of the 7 remaining men had succumbed. Their screams and thrashing had transformed into gurgles and convulsions as the poisons took their full effect. Mavis remained unseen, a phantom in the dim light, watching her work with a chilling serenity. Outside, the moon hid behind clouds, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of the night's deeds. The last 2 men were cautious, their suspicion heightened by the deaths of their comrades. Yet pride and arrogance clouded their judgment, compelling them to wear the robes, confident that no simple girl could challenge their authority. Mavis's hands were steady as she fitted the final garments with care, whispering under her breath an incantation taught by her grandmother, a protective charm for herself and a silent curse for the men about to suffer. Minutes passed like hours. She heard the first muted scream, then the second. The cries swallowed almost immediately by the thick cotton of the robes. Outside, the wind rose slightly, carrying the sounds into the fields, rustling the corn stalks, and alerting even the night birds that something unnatural had occurred. By the time the hour of 2 approached, all 7 men were incapacitated, writhing, choking, and contorted by the silent, deadly justice Mavis had so meticulously crafted. She stepped back, taking in the scene, robes stained with sweat, tears, and the first hints of blood, all signs of the terror these men had instilled in others finally coming home. Mavis exhaled slowly, the weight of her actions settling on her shoulders. This night, she had not only exacted revenge but had also sent a clear message. The powerless, when determined, could wield a kind of power that fear itself could not defend against. The plantation had become a stage, and Mavis, once invisible and underestimated, had commanded it entirely. She folded the last hood, setting it aside, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The reckoning was not yet complete. There were still consequences to unfold, whispers of terror to spread, but for now, she had achieved the impossible. The men who had once thought themselves untouchable lay at her mercy, their power reduced to nothing more than ragged cotton and poisoned threads. And in the quiet that followed, only Mavis's heartbeat echoed, steady and resolute, as the night held its breath in awe and fear of the laundry slave girl, who had turned tables on the most feared men of the county. Dawn had not yet broken, and the plantation remained eerily silent. The usual morning noises, the clatter of pans, the crowing of roosters, the shouts of overseers were absent. It was as if the land itself had recoiled from the horrors that had unfolded the previous night. Mavis, hidden behind the tall stacks of laundry, moved with careful precision. Tonight would be the final act, the last step in a plan she had nurtured for months. A plan that would ensure that the terror inflicted upon the enslaved could never be repeated by those who had wielded it so recklessly. The remaining 10 robes lay folded on the table, each one infused with her painstakingly prepared mixture. Not just poison, but a combination of lye, crushed nightshade, and the residual toxins from plants she had studied in secret, passed down from her grandmother's old herbal manuscripts. Each robe was designed not only to incapacitate but to terrorize, to force those who had inflicted pain to experience a shadow of it themselves, amplified by the element of surprise. She could hear the first steps of the men as they approached the laundry. They had grown wary after the previous night's events, whispering amongst themselves about curses, bad luck, and restless spirits. Their arrogance, however, still outweighed their fear. They believed no mere girl could hold sway over their fate. They were about to learn otherwise. Mavis's heart beat steadily. Her hands, trained through months of careful preparation, moved deftly, inserting the poisoned linings into each robe. Her fingers traced the seams, ensuring every corner, every fold, concealed the deadly mixture. As she worked, her mind returned to the faces of the men she had already dispatched. The greedy overseer Tomlin, the cruel woodcutter Reynolds, and the others who had brought misery to generations. Each memory sharpened her resolve, each injustice added precision to her movements. The first of tonight's victims, Grayson, stepped into the laundry, smiling at the thought of wielding control once more. He had heard whispers, yes, but his pride would not allow caution. Mavis stepped silently behind the shadows, her small figure invisible in the dim candlelight. She watched as he selected a robe, then guided him to the fitting room. He had no idea that the fabric he touched carried the culmination of every insult, every act of cruelty he had committed. The poison worked swiftly. Grayson's first inhalation brought a sudden dizziness, followed by a creeping numbness that spread from his fingertips to his shoulders. His eyes widened in terror as the effects intensified. Mavis observed silently, her pulse steady, knowing that each second of his panic was a reflection of the fear he had once instilled in others. The remaining 9 men arrived in staggered intervals, each greeted by the same cruel trick. Their laughter turned to screams, their confident strides to clumsy thrashes against walls and furniture. The stench of sweat, vomit, and chemical burn filled the laundry room, a bitter testament to the justice Mavis had wrought. No one could escape the immediate horror of their own arrogance, nor the inevitability of the punishment now bearing down on them. Outside, the wind carried the muffled cries to the farthest reaches of the plantation. Birds took flight in panic, and even the dogs, long trained to attack intruders, cowered as if they too understood that the rules of this land had changed. Mavis, though small and seemingly powerless, had become the arbiter of fate, the silent force capable of toppling men who had once thought themselves untouchable. By the stroke of 2 in the morning, all 10 men were incapacitated. Some convulsed violently, others gurgled and coughed as the poison took its full toll. Their once commanding presence was reduced to writhing forms on the floor, eyes wide with the realization that they had been defeated not by force, but by intellect, patience, and the careful orchestration of a mind underestimated by all. Mavis stood at the center of the chaos, her hands folded, her face calm. She breathed in the scent of cotton, sweat, and the faint metallic tang that now clung to the air. Every robe had done its work, every man had felt the consequences of his cruelty, and the plantation's silent witness to generations of injustice seemed to exhale a long-held sigh of relief. She did not gloat. This was not triumph for vanity, but for justice. Each victim would remember the night for the rest of his days, a living lesson that terror, no matter how entrenched, could be overcome. Mavis's revenge was not born from hate alone, but from the unyielding pursuit of balance in a world that had long denied her any semblance of power. Finally, she collected the robes, folding them carefully into a chest, ensuring that no trace remained of her meticulous work. Outside, the first faint light of dawn began to creep across the fields, washing the plantation in gold. Birds slowly resumed their songs, the wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in decades, the estate felt like it belonged to no man, no terror, but to the quiet, resolute spirit who had endured and now, finally, reclaimed her space. Mavis stepped outside, letting the cool morning touch her skin. She allowed herself a small, satisfied breath, knowing that the night had not only changed the lives of those who had tormented her people, but had also set a precedent. Even the smallest and quietest could hold within themselves the power to shape destiny, to turn fear into justice, and to reclaim a world that had once seemed forever lost. And as she walked into the mist of dawn, Mavis knew this was not the end but a beginning, the night that would echo in whispers and legends for generations to come. The sun had barely risen when the plantation began to stir, though the usual rhythm of life was broken. Birds called hesitantly, unsure if the world was safe. The fields lay quiet, the laborers moving in cautious, measured steps. Rumors had already begun to ripple through the enslaved quarters, whispers about what had happened in the laundry, about Mavis, and the men who would never hold power again. Mavis remained hidden, observing the slow return of the day. She had washed herself in the creek before anyone was awake, letting the cold water run over her arms and shoulders. Each droplet carried away the fear, the tension, the anticipation that had built over months of planning. She had done what she set out to do. Justice had been served, but the world outside her shadowed sanctuary would not accept it silently. By mid-morning, the first overseers stumbled onto the scene, though most were too wary to act immediately. Grayson, Reynolds, and the others who had survived the initial poisonings were reduced to trembling shadows, eyes wide, skin pale, and bodies trembling with residual pain. They could barely stand, their commanding voices gone, replaced by pitiful groans. Mavis watched from a distance as the other men confronted them, some fearing retaliation, some horrified at the strange twists of fate. The plantation owner, unaware of the specific events, arrived, his horse kicking up dust as he approached the laundry. He stopped abruptly at the sight before him. His overseers, his supposed enforcers, were cowering, writhing, and unable to command respect from their men or the field slaves. Panic rose in his chest. The illusion of control he had carefully maintained for years was cracking, and he knew instinctively that this was no ordinary punishment. Something deeper, more insidious, had taken place. Mavis moved among the shadows, her presence unseen but felt. She could hear the frantic whispers, the curses, the promises of revenge that were already spilling from the lips of men too humbled to act immediately. Every glance cast her way was met with nothing, for she was not yet ready to reveal herself. She had learned long ago that power was often invisible, and tonight, invisibility had been her ally. News of the event began to spread beyond the plantation walls. By noon, whispers reached neighboring estates, merchants, and even local magistrates. Some laughed at the idea, dismissing the stories as folklore, while others grew uneasy, fearful that the tale might not be an exaggeration. Rumors of Mavis's intelligence, cunning, and courage began to precede her. The whispers described her not just as a slave, but as a force to be reckoned with, a woman who could manipulate circumstances, twist fate, and strike fear into those who had never known it before. The enslaved community, hidden behind the edges of fields and barns, watched with cautious joy. Mavis had achieved what many had only dreamed of, a night of reckoning, where the oppressors had felt a fraction of the terror they had inflicted for decades. Quiet celebrations began in secret. Small smiles, discreet nods, and careful gestures acknowledging her brilliance and bravery. But even in triumph, Mavis knew caution was essential. The master and neighboring planters would soon seek retribution if she revealed herself too openly. As the sun climbed, Mavis retreated to her quarters, taking stock of the aftermath. She moved quietly, gathering scraps of evidence that could link the poisonings back to her if needed, ensuring that she maintained the illusion that this was a supernatural punishment, a curse, a shadowy hand from beyond. Her mind replayed the night in meticulous detail, the screams, the convulsions, the panic, and finally, the silence. Each moment was a victory, each terrorized man a lesson in humility and consequence. By evening, the estate had settled into an uneasy tension. The overseers, physically weakened and psychologically scarred, huddled in their quarters. The owner paced the floors, muttering about discipline, curses, and the inexplicable failures of his men. The enslaved slaves moved carefully, performing their chores with measured precision, aware that Mavis's plan had temporarily shifted the balance of power, but that prudence was still required to maintain safety. Mavis stepped outside once more, breathing in the cool night air. Stars sparkled above, indifferent witnesses to the upheaval below. Her mind was already planning the next steps, knowing that survival required foresight and patience. She was aware that stories of the laundry's night of horror would grow, that myths and legends would begin to surround her, and that fear could become both weapon and shield. She paused by the edge of the fields, looking toward the distant forest. There was power in fear, yes, but also danger. The world would not allow her actions to go unnoticed indefinitely. Yet, for now, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The balance of terror had shifted, even if just slightly, and she had proven that even the seemingly powerless could wield unimaginable influence. And so, in the dark of night, Mavis's reputation began to solidify a silent, unyielding force that would haunt the minds of the men who had believed themselves untouchable. The laundry, once a place of mundane labor, had become a crucible of justice, a symbol of cunning, resilience, and the enduring power of a woman who refused to be subjugated. The morning after, the plantation was eerily quiet. Birds hesitated to call, and even the wind seemed to pause, as if aware of the lingering tension. Mavis had not been seen, though those who knew her well understood she was never far from the shadows. The poisoned robes had changed everything. The fear had shifted, and with it, the invisible boundaries of power. The master himself emerged from his house mid-morning, eyes squinting in the sun. He had heard reports from the surviving overseers, though their groans and trembling voices did little to clarify the events. He stepped toward the laundry, tension coiling in his shoulders. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted him. The stench of bile and fear lingered in the air, and even his horse seemed uneasy, stamping at the dirt, snorting nervously. Inside the laundry, Mavis's work had left a haunting scene. Satchels and robes, carefully folded, had betrayed the men's arrogance. There was no immediate evidence of poison, no sign of direct attack, only the lingering traces of her careful preparation, the subtle residues that a skilled chemist might recognize, but most could not. She had relied on precision, timing, and the element of surprise. It was artistry disguised as labor, revenge disguised as routine. The master walked slowly, inspecting the laundry. His gaze hardened as he noticed the subtle chaos clothes strewn here and there, small stains he could not identify, and the faint odor of chemicals lingering faintly in the air. Panic began to creep into his chest as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. The pride of his plantation, the invisible walls of control, were now breached, and he had no idea how or by whom. The surviving overseers, pale and trembling, slunk behind him, offering little more than anxious glances. Their authority was shattered, their confidence eroded, and even their loyalty wavered. Each man's eyes darted toward the shadows, imagining the unseen force responsible. They dared not speak her name aloud. Mavis had become a specter, more myth than human. Her presence felt everywhere and nowhere at once. Rumors began to spread beyond the plantation. Neighboring estates whispered of the cursed laundry, of the invisible hand that had struck the Klan men down. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others as divine retribution, and a few as pure witchcraft. Yet all acknowledged one truth. Mavis had become a name to fear. The stories would grow with every retelling, each version more elaborate than the last, cementing her legacy in terror and respect. By afternoon, the enslaved workers cautiously returned to their tasks, though eyes constantly scanned the edges of the property. Even the men who had once bullied them now walked with humility. Fear had created a new hierarchy, one in which Mavis's cunning and courage commanded reverence. Those who had seen her method, even from a distance, understood that she had rewritten the rules of survival, turning routine labor into a weapon of unimaginable precision. Mavis herself watched from a distant tree line, her expression unreadable. She observed the chaos she had wrought, the panic etched on the faces of men who had believed themselves untouchable. A sense of quiet satisfaction washed over her, tempered by caution. She knew the balance of power was fragile, that retaliation could come swiftly, but for now, She had the advantage. Knowledge and fear were her allies, and she wielded them masterfully. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the fields, Mavis moved silently, checking the edges of her traps and ensuring that no evidence could trace the events back to her directly. Every detail mattered, every scent, every footprint, every residue. She had learned that survival required precision, patience, and the ability to vanish like smoke at the first hint of danger. Night fell over the plantation, bringing a cool, heavy darkness. Mavis returned to her quarters, yet sleep eluded her. She thought of the men whose arrogance had underestimated her, of the power she had claimed for herself through intellect and cunning. The robes had been just the beginning. The legend would continue, carried by whispers, rumors, and fear. And as the moon rose high, silver and cold over the quiet fields, the shadows seemed to move on their own. Mavis stepped into them willingly, a ghost in her own story, ensuring that the memory of that night, the night she had poisoned, 17 Klan robes and watched terror unravel, would live long after she had gone. By dawn, the plantation bore the usual appearance of calm, but beneath the surface, the fear persisted. Men spoke in hushed tones. Slaves exchanged knowing glances, and the master's authority had been irrevocably shaken. Mavis had proven that a single person, armed with cunning and courage, could turn the tools of oppression into instruments of justice. Her name would not be forgotten,